So hello. Thanks
Hello.
everyone for attending. This is the third and last for the semester in our series of author Q&As for health authors who can't go on tour this year. This is sponsored by the Center for the Study of Human Health at Emory University, where I am a senior fellow within the Emory College, and co-sponsored by the Georgia Center for the Book. We're so grateful for their support. And if any of you have come in to this webinar through their links, we're really, really happy to have you. And I'm thrilled to have with us this afternoon or evening, my friend, the journalist and author, Emily Willingham, PhD. Emily is both a scientist and a science writer. She has an undergraduate degree in English Lit and a PhD in biology, and she also did a postdoc in urology, which probably has something to do with the subject of her book. So she is the author of previous books, The Informed Parent, a science-based resource for your child's first 4 years, which she co-authored with Tara Haley. And her writing has appeared in a number of the most important outlets across the country: the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, Scientific American, papers such as the San Francisco Chronicle, the site Undark, all names really well known to science writers. She's also working on another book called The Tailored Brain, and this new book, Fallacy, Life Lessons from the Animal Penis, has been out a little bit more than a month, I think, and we're so thrilled to have her. So Emily, sorry about the connection problems. Thank you for being with us. Thanks for being tolerant.
Thanks so much for having me.
So the way this usually works is that I spend about 30 minutes interrogating the author about a variety of things, and then we open things up to our attendees who will have questions. I know you've done this before. Because we're in the webinar format for Zoom, you won't hear their voices. They will put their questions in the Q&A box. I believe that you can read them, but if not, I will read them to you, and I'll probably read them so the rest of the audience can hear them as well. I do want to remind everyone that you can put your questions in the Q&A box at any time. You don't have to wait for me to announce that it's time to ask questions now. They will stay there and I will see them as just at the point at which I turn things over to that part of my screen. So please go ahead if you've already seen the book or you've already seen the blurb about the book and you have questions now. So Emily, let's get started. It's always appropriate, I think, for us to begin these things, even though people have come to this because they know who you are, they know about the book. If you would tell us a little bit about who you are and particularly how the arc of your career brought you to write this book.
Let's see. I think I was born a writer, so it started that way. I might have had a pen in my hand when I came out. I'm not sure. From there, I progressed to getting the bachelor's degree in English because I thought I would be a creative writer, like, short stories, fiction. So it turns out there's not a lot of money in that. And during the process of that, I also thought I would be a journalist, but there was a hurdle I never overcame at the University of Texas at Austin that involved taking an AP test for it. So I got the English degree instead. And after a few years working in public affairs, I went back to school in the biological sciences because I had thought if I was going to be a journalist, I would have wanted to be a science writer. But then I got so interested in science, I thought, well, maybe I'll become a scientist instead. So I did that. And while I was in graduate school and through a couple of tenure track jobs in my postdoc, I kept freelancing as a journalist as well, which was fun to do. It was a good kind of side thing to do, just to keep my hand in and remember how to write things that weren't scientific papers, which is qualitatively very different. I did a postdoc in urology with a U, not an N, so, lower down than the brain at the University of California, San Francisco, where I did indeed learn quite a bit about penises. And so that does definitely feed into how I got to writing this book. My PhD is actually in gonads, so that was the start. And then the postdoc was in how penises develop. So it kind of went on from gonads to penises, which I feel like, laid a good foundation for writing a book like this.
So was there any particular I hesitate to say inciting incident, but any particular reason why you wanted to write this book? And I guess it's important to say why right now, given that as you reference in the text, penises are particularly important in our culture, and the display of penises and the sending of pictures of penises. It's just today or yesterday that Jeffrey Toobin of The New Yorker was fired from that august magazine for appearing on a Zoom call alongside his penis, which seemed a little inappropriate for work. Yeah. So how you got to this book?
I had actually been working with my agent on the brain book that's coming up next. And so this got kind of reversed. And while we were going through, well, what would be the big question of the brain book and how to go about answering it? I was just driving around one day. I have 3 sons and they may well have all been in the car at the time. And I remember just like this sort of little voice just surfacing from somewhere in my brain. It was like, wait a minute, you do know a lot about penises. Is there a book about those? So I went and kind of did a little bit of market research, and there really wasn't one that focused completely on them, especially from the perspective of someone like me. And so I just sent my agent this really short email about what about a book about penises? And she called me within about an hour. I mean, when does that ever happen, right? And we started talking about the fit for the zeitgeist. They're just everywhere, right? And why is that? And why? What social commentary is there in looking at the animal kingdom and the penises, the non-human penises out there, and how can that contextualize what we see today with the human version?
So we're being sort of lighthearted with these mentions of dick pics and Jeffrey Toobin and so forth, but there's a long history, a history as long as our culture, of penises being an object not of fun, but of threat and a sort of synecdoche for power. And you lay out the stakes right at the start of the book with this story from your childhood of being threatened by someone by means of their penis. So I was really struck that you began with that, but it seems such in retrospect, such an obvious way to talk about how important this topic is. So can you tell us that story?
Sure. The story frames the book because there's one that's a little bit worse, I think, at the end of the book, not a little bit, but a lot. And a content warning actually for people who are watching, because this does involve some attempted, bad behavior related to penises. I was 12. It was summer. It's Texas. I was at my grandmother's house. She had multiple sclerosis. She was in a wheelchair. She could not walk, so she was always in the wheelchair. And she had a swimming pool, and my younger sibling and I were swimming that day. And there was a man, I call him Eddie, in the opening of the book, who was cutting these ligustrums. There was this all sounds quite ritzy, but it really wasn't. But there was a shabby pool house kind of structure that had a bunch of those big black inner tubes that you can blow up and paddle around in. And I went at one point to get one of those. And while I was in there trying to choose one, there was an open window to my right. And I heard this sound, just an attention getting kind of sound. And I looked over and he was standing there and he had his penis out. And I didn't realize until much later what he was doing, but he was masturbating with his penis out. And I was 12 and not especially street smart, but I knew that this was intended to be a not good thing. It's the first adult penis I'd ever seen. I decamped really quickly from the pool house, jumped in the swimming pool, water over my head, thought about it, thought about my grandmother, thought about my sibling, thought about, well, what can I do here? Because I couldn't leave. I felt if I left, that would endanger them because he was being so threatening about this. He spent the next, and I don't know how long it was, it seemed like hours, but it was at least an hour, maybe 2, the next period of time, walking around behind my grandmother and doing the same thing and being very threatening while he was doing it. And so I really got this very strong message that he had ill intent. And so I just didn't know what to do. I couldn't run into the main house, try to use the phone. She had a phone in her wheelchair. I couldn't feel like I could grab that and, call somebody. I just didn't know what to do. Finally, my father did come to pick us up. And when we got home, I told my mother immediately. I was interviewed by the DA. They, charged him. And I remember being kind of perplexed the whole time I was being interviewed. that they kept asking me just about the penis part of it. Like, what was he doing with it? And, how many times I was just like, he was threatening us. He was walking around, really clearly sending this message. He was going to try to harm somebody if I raised any alarm here. And I coalesced that a lot later, thinking, why did they focus so much on the penis when there was this whole man there who could cause us harm and danger, and the penis not so much, actually, right? And I just think that fits in with our whole reductive approach to how we think about men and how we think about penises, and we don't contextualize them. And so part of the message of this book is kind of decentering the penis to take a look more at the whole person and the behaviors of that person. That was difficult to tell.
Yeah. So, I mean, you tell it very, I wouldn't say in a lighthearted manner in the book, but it's clear in the book that, well, in the tone in the book is that this is an event in your life that was formative for some of your interests, but at the same time, it's something that you've come to terms with, and you've sort of like put it in the right place in your personal history. But now that I hear you actually verbalize it, it sounds like it still, it really left an impression on you.
It sticks, because I should add that he did end up going to prison for this. He confessed and he went to prison. I just the other day, I walked by a row of ligustrums and thought about it. I can't actually look at ligustrums without remembering that incident. So it was pretty profound for me.
Was it a thing that you had, did it stick with you your whole life, or was it something that you'd sort of put away and then it came back when you started to study gonads or study urology?
It stuck with me my whole life. I mean, there were some sequelae to it that kind of reinforced it. He sent over a couple of people to our house to threaten us, some things like that I didn't add into the introduction because they weren't on point about the whole, the point that I was making. There were some other things around it, episodes around it, that just served to reinforce it, definitely. And another thing, I think a lot of girls and women can relate to this, is for a long time I was thinking, well, did I do something? Like, what was there something in my behavior, my presentation? I was very prepubescent. I even, to the point that I feel like I have to make this excuse. I was wearing a whole bathing suit. It was a one piece, very modest sort of little girl one piece bathing suit. I mean, that kind of thing, right? Why do I feel like I have to explain that? So that lingered for a long time.
So thanks for telling us this story. And now let's flip over to some of the more fun parts of the book so that we observe balance, because there's a lot of fun and funny stuff in this book, and your very dry, underhanded wit about some of the absurd things that we think about penises or have been said about penises by scientists, or even some of the descriptions that have been made of penises throughout the animal kingdom. Your wit really underlies them. And I'm really curious about sort of how you found that tone, because as you say, this is an object that, an organ that is in many ways so central to our culture, for good or ill, and also was attached to such an important experience in your past, and yet you managed to sort of hold it at a distance and often to be quite funny about it.
I think humor almost invariably, like often, especially if it's kind of not punching down at people, humor, right, is a defense mechanism. And so I think I've always employed that for different purposes. In this case, I mean, some of that stuff is just funny, right? I mean, some of the things animals do and our reaction to them more so is pretty funny. I did try to temper it. I mean, I didn't use that in, serious stories or situations. And sometimes it's angry humor. I think that, wanders over into the field of sarcasm probably, but, some of it is not like yeehaw humor. It's kind of angry humor. It's just my voice. I think I did do a free write first for every chapter with just, this is how I would say this, is kind of how I started with it. So that's why it comes out that way.
So one of the things that, so we've been talking about human penises, obviously, starting with the story from your past, but the thing that's so glorious about the book is that it is, as you say, life lessons from the animal kingdom. And in it, you cover this incredible diversity, which I had no idea existed, of what penises are and are not, and how penises sometimes aren't penises or don't do the things that we think that penises do. You even come up with a new word to describe the organ that does the thing that we think that penises do, because penises don't always do it. So can you talk about that diversity a bit?
Yeah, sure. I obviously think it's really fascinating because I wrote a book about it, but people, I think humans, we think of penis as being something like our own, maybe fleshy. There's a tube, it transmits, gametes, usually sperm actually, and semen. And that's kind of what it does. That's its job, right? You insert it into a partner and you transmit. But as the book highlights, there are all kinds of body parts that actually are used for that purpose. Some of them are legs, some of them are little structures on the head. Some of them, do that, but then they do a lot of other different things. They can be like tools and weapons and things like that. And we don't use ours like that. Ours is fairly nondescript, on the less wow end of things, which is great for us because when we are using it appropriately and consensually, it can be a whole lot of fun, right? But, like when you look at insects, for example, there a lot of the structures they use for this they come from plates on their abdomens, which, is not kind of our idea of how this goes. And so it's very different across species.
Did you have a favorite penis in this vast array?
I have been answering this question because every day kind of seems like it's different. And then I realized the other day, actually my favorite penis is really probably the human penis, right? I mean, because that's the best one from my perspective. But just in terms of like what the heck, I still have to say.
Let's say intellectually engaging.
I still have to say that I don't know. My favorite one still is the seed beetle, just because it has so many little features on it. It has spikes and there's a hook and it has little jaw-like structures on it, which just seems so alien to us as humans. And I kind of made the seed beetle a character because of that, because it's pretty well studied. And because it does have a really interesting intromittent organ, as they call it. Yeah.
So one of the things that is fascinating to me about the book, knowing very little about, despite being a science writer, very little about biology or anatomy, is the way in which, so first you note several times the degree to which science about penises somehow fails to take notice of vaginas, even though penises and vaginas, or the things that function as penises and the things that function as recipients of sperm, we would assume are meant to be a matched pair. You talk about the lock and key analogy. So I think what I want to ask you about first is sort of the neglect of vaginas as a topic, or things that receive sperm. And then we can talk a bit about how those two organs do or don't evolve together, right, or if not together, then in opposition to each other.
And so the book is ostensibly about penises. I mean, right, it's in the title, but it's fallacy with a PH for a reason. And there are lots of different reasons, but one is I centered this in the book. Instead of the penis, I centered the central chapter of the book is vaginas. And one of the main points of that chapter is that when you look at the studies of genitalia, the focus on vaginas is very limited. And you see a lot of focus on penises. And it's not just a passive lack of attention to vaginas or, things that we construe as those, but active in some cases. You look at, studies or books, even entire books and reviews that purport to say, here's a review of genitalia. And they'll actually say, well, we just figured the vagina is pretty boring. And so we're just, not even going to talk about that. Like, it's active. And there is, I thought this was pretty interesting. There was a man whose name is spelled Cockburn, which sounds, reads like it should be Cockburn, but I'm told it's Coburn. So, and he wrote a book about gonorrhea a few centuries ago, and or the gonorrheas, because apparently I think they thought there was more than one. and he says in the book, he says he thinks that the seat of this disease is the vagina, right? Like somehow there's leakage from the vagina. There's a lot of leaking that goes along around, like among female animals, apparently. And there's some leakage from the vagina that causes this disease. But then he spends about 500 words talking about vaginas with some weird anatomical mistakes, which I guess is understandable given the time. And then he spends another several thousand words talking about the penis. I mean, it's just the vagina is responsible for this, but okay, bye. And then let's talk about what it does to, you know, the penis. Even, of course, women were affected by that as well. All kinds of examples like that.
I noted that. And first, I did notice Coburn, which, of course, if you see it written out as Cockburn, and
yes,
there just seem to be a lot of people drawn to this particular branch of science by their names, I think.
The names are striking, yes.
So one of so springing off from Coburn, it's really remarkable, or maybe it's predictable, how many of the researchers you quote or have to quote in the first part of the book are male, who have been drawn to the study of penises and their equivalents, we will assume because they feel some, I guess, kind of fellow feeling to them. But then there's a moment when a female scientist enters your narrative and upends a lot of the thinking, in particular about duck penises. Is that right? That the duck penises are like unbelievably elaborate, right. And it's assumed that duck vaginas are just kind of recipients for that unbelievably elaborate penis. But this scientist finds out that actually there's something much more complicated going on. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so ducks are infamous, right? Or at least some, for having forced copulation, as we call it. And that means that the male duck really is aggressive with the female and has this ballistic, this is a different species of ducks, but we've known this at least since the 1990s, if not longer. Ballistic corkscrew penis comes, bursts out, corkscrews in, bam, bam, he's done, he flies away. And she's just like, what? And sorry. So we've known that for a really long time. It's been long enough. And so the scientist you mentioned is Patricia Brennan, who's at Mount Holyoke. And she was working in a lab where they were dissecting vaginas, but not so they could look at them, just so they could look at one part of it relative to what had happened with the penis that had been inserted into it. And she thought, maybe we should take a look at this whole thing. I don't know, maybe so. So she did. And of course, she's, a woman, and she takes a look at this and discovers, not shockingly, given the context of copulation between these ducks, that the vaginas in ducks where there's just forced copulation have some kind of concomitant features that seem to be adaptively rejecting the ballistic corkscrew penis. Like they have a corkscrew that goes the other direction. They're cul-de-sacs. They were just like, seem to just get stuck and go to die, and never make it anywhere. But we did not know that because nobody had looked until 2005. I mean, this is 21st century that they finally looked at that, which just really strikes me.
I love the story because it's such a corrective to both the narrative, the scientific narrative, and also sort of the meta narrative, which I suppose we can blame Freud for, of as of the penis, and by extension men attached to penises, peni, as actors, and women, or vaginas, or women as vaginas as a synecdoche for women being just sort of the passive recipients, never the actors. Right. And then this female scientist walks into this equation and blows it up. Yeah. That's that's narratively satisfying to me. Yep. Do you think is she unique in that, or is there more corrective science to be done around the relative, I guess, agency of penises?
She's not unique, and certainly there are other women who are doing this kind of research now. But just within the last few years, they did a study looking at what is the focus of studies of genitalia, and it still leans sharply towards sort of the penis on a male animal side of things. And I phrase it that way because not all of these structures occur on male animals. There are animals we construe as female that have structures like this as well. The big arching story scientifically is that this was such an anti-scientific way to do these things, because the idea was, is it okay if I talk now about the tensions between them in copulation? Can I?
Yeah, sure.
Sure. Okay. The idea like with something like the ducks is with forced copulation and with these penises that have all these, features on them, that there's some like pressure, like evolutionary pressure that is leading to these adaptations so that this duck penis can get past some kind of obstacles or something that's, hurdles in its way. Given that, you would think that then you would see concomitantly adaptive structures in the female, in the copulatory partner. And so you should look at that, right? Because if you're really wanting to demonstrate this call and response, the forced copulation with these features on the penis, you'd want to look for them, in the recipient as well. And it's really surprising to me that that was so limited, especially with vertebrates. Just didn't look really, literally lines in the literature that just say, male genitalia is really extravagant, but we just figure the female genitalia, there's just not much to look at there. I don't know. It just seems evolutionarily nonsensical to make that assumption.
So a fair number of the people who are listening to this are students at Emory who are pre-med, pre-public health, pre-nursing, pre-nutrition, pre-veterinary science, things like that. And so I hope they're getting the message that, as we already know from human clinical research, that for too long, women were treated as just sort of like deficient men, right? That is, in some ways, that's kind of fundamentally the Freudian approach, that women are men, only less so. And it hasn't been all that long that we've had the corrective that women are actually different. And I sort of hear that same revision of the research point of view in what you're describing, that vaginas and the beings that harbor them were just thought of as being sort of uninteresting footnotes to the central research, the central paradigm, which was the male. And now, thanks to some of these scientists, that we're getting a much more holistic view of the, as you say, the call and response of anatomical evolution, which is much preferable to me.
I think that that's accurate. Who's been asking the questions and how they choose to answer them has, been driven by one one group in particular. Just today at a cancer conference, they have a study showing that they need to reconfigure radiotherapy for women who've had anal cancer because they have been destroying the clitoral bulb and obviously affecting their sex lives. And it just, I guess, hadn't occurred to them before now that they might need to reconfigure what they're doing there so that they don't destroy this really important structure for these women.
That's really fascinating and so
continued.
Sad.
Yes. No.
So I want to remind everyone that it's possible to ask questions at any time. And there are already some questions coming into the Q&A chat, which I love, and we'll get to them quite shortly. So thanks very much. So that's a reminder to you while I go on with another couple of questions. So I would love it if we could sort of, we've been spending a lot of time at sort of the end of your subtitle, from the animal kingdom, but what I want to move to is kind of the life lessons. And right. I would love to sort of drag, in the way that interviewers do, drag you up to 30,000 feet and ask you to make big statements. But I would like to hear kind of the big statements about what this study of animal anatomy and physiology, in the context of your own work as a human physiologist and journalist, taught you about sort of how we think about human penises, but in human culture, and also how we sort of allow them to be a stand-in for our concepts of masculinity and power and kind of centrality to human existence.
Big question, but I think I could give a couple of these things. So first of all, the pattern you see, the lesson that you see when you look at our penis among a lot of other animals is that, well, this is kind of a broad pattern that the more features it has, the more bells and whistles like you see on the dove penis or the seed beetle, the less likely there is to be this process of developing some form of intimacy, like not like human intimacy where you really get to know each other well over coffee or something, but just like, checking some boxes until you make that physical intimate contact. The pattern is that the less adorned the penis is, the more likely there is to be this process, this expectation behaviorally, that you will sort of kind of go through whatever species version of consent is before you get to that point, right? And so when you contextualize the human penis against this backdrop of just so many possible examples of, what much more adorned animal penises, you realize ours is one of the consensual, intimate versions of this. Like it communicates that we have an expectation of intimacy, that there's not an expectation of forced copulation, which I feel like I should say, because people have argued that there's some evolutionary basis to something like rape. And, no, that's no. So that's one of the messages. The other one is that as my last chapter, I think, unfolds most clearly, is that we have centered the penis and replaced entire human beings with by reducing them to this organ. And so this rash of, I'm going to send you this, picture of my penis because, wow, look at that thing, which is not really usually the reaction. They've done studies. That's not how, at least women who receive these react to them, unsolicited pictures like that. And there's a reason that they have this perception and that they focus so much on it. And that's this kind of impossible masculinity that we have set up for people who identify as men in our culture. And I think that we can work to dismantle that. I mean, I think it's already in progress, thank goodness. But we have this idea that people with penises have to meet certain bar to be considered masculine. And I think that we need to recalibrate what we view as masculine. I think we need to understand that there are all kinds of ways to be masculine. There's no one true way. And to set up this impossible masculinity just creates this whole arena, this like, what is my word, milieu? Just like just a swamp of toxicity around, especially boys and men, and pressures on them to be some kind of way that maybe it's not how they are. And so when we see a man walk into a Starbucks with an AR-15 hanging off his back, and I see people comment and they say small dick energy, when they see that, they've taken this whole person, and I'm not pitying him necessarily, and certainly not excusing him, but they're taking this entire human being and reducing him to this body part that doesn't even identify him necessarily as a man, instead of looking at all of these different directions of pressure that come onto a person and make them feel that they've got to be performative that way, in this kind of impossibly masculine way, just to do whatever it is that people think they're doing when they do that for their in-group, look what I've got here, look what I did. And then I guess they're hoping to do what that guy did in the ligustrums that day, to terrorize, except, in this case with a giant weapon.
So I have so many more questions for you, but I want to be sure that the audience gets their questions in. So I'm going to ask some of those now. And it seems like we're going to have some questions about research and about storytelling, and I'm going to get to those in a moment. But the one that I want to go to first is really sort of a kind of the flip side of what you were just saying, which is if we have this sort of cultural centrality to the penis, as inappropriate or reductive as that is, how do we get the same sort of how do we elevate the narrative of the vagina to get it as central to our culture as penises have come to be?
I think that maybe I would, of course, like to see attention to the vagina. I think it's important for all kinds of reasons, for scientific reasons, for health reasons, et cetera. But if we're really talking about identity, I kind of think we should take a step back from the anatomical parts of this and really take a look at, I land in the last chapter of the book on the brain, because that's really what we're expressing, right? We're expressing what happens in there. And I think that we could attend to that more in terms of gender expression and so forth, rather than focusing so much on, well, gosh, what's behind the zipper there? That said, obviously we need to look more at this anatomy that has been overlooked for lots and lots of different reasons that are very specific to things like health or basic science understanding and that kind of thing. But socially, I feel like we could all just take a step back and look at our heads.
So related to that, another really smart question is, Has the fact that society has become more accepting of or welcoming to transgender identity, and that people who are transitioning to a male identity may have sexual reassignment surgery that constructs a penis for them. In other words, that a penis is not something that is gifted to you by evolution, but is something that can be created. Is that doing anything to change our narrative around what penises mean?
I think that it's a two-way interaction. I'm hoping, I mean, maybe this is aspirational, but I'm hoping that people are understanding that penises don't make men, and men don't always have penises, and that the reverse is true of that. And that opens the way for people if they want to pursue that, because that is the feeling that they have. And that is what is going to make them feel like the way they feel already. It's going to manifest that for them. I'm hoping that the way things are going right now, broadly, obviously, maybe not in some specific populations, that we are seeing some progress on that front.
I assumed this question was going to come up, and someone is asking it, so I don't have to. So you are married to a man, and as you mentioned, you have 3 sons. So how? I guess the first question is, how did that affect your writing of this book? You mentioned that they were present when you sort of came up with the idea, but also particularly for your sons, how has what you've learned, does it affect what you teach them, how you speak to them? Has it reframed them or their concepts of identity for you in any way?
I have to say not really, because I kind of came to it with those ideas anyway. I mean, maybe I'm forcing a narrative, but no, I mean, I'm not, but I think that way anyway. And they were reared to have an understanding and to be comfortable with who they are, et cetera. I don't talk about them publicly, but they're all in their teens now. And, but I will say that I had them in mind when I was writing, especially the last chapter, and how we need to take a closer look at a whole human and not just gauge people who present as male or men based on like something about their penises. I really think that we need to do that needs to be a focus.
So it really sounds as though you were thinking about these concepts even before you landed on, before the idea for the book kind of rose up out of your subconscious, but it rose out of things that you had already been thinking about.
Yeah, I think, there's a spectrum of this kind of thing, right? I mean, Sylvia Plath wrote about wanting entry into sort of male spaces, not because she herself felt that was her presentation, but because she was interested in what was going on in there, and she wanted to just go in there and look at stuff, right, without being hassled. I mean, I think a lot of us can relate to that. And so there's this, you've got that kind of interest, and what people would classify as sort of masculine interest and all this other stuff. I think a lot of us who identify as girls and women can relate to that feeling, right? And that can be intensified all the way until, you relate to feeling that you are. That's how you will present. And I think about that kind of thing all the time. I certainly, when I was younger, wanted into male spaces, and I've been thinking since I was quite young about, why am I not allowed in here? Why would I be excluded just because of this presentation? Why am I being treated in a certain way because of how I present? And I think, and it's all they're all drawing inferences based on the anatomy with which I present. And so, yeah, I think I've been thinking about that for a very long time.
I remember when I was in college for one of my science classes, my whole class was sent to the Cosmos Club this is in Washington, D.C., which was a historic sort of club and gathering space for scientists. And it was so taken for granted that scientists were men, that women had, including the female students being sent to listen to the speech, had to enter through the side door. I think they've changed that in the intervening decades, but it was such an outrage. I have this vague sense, but I may be narrativizing myself here, that I think I refused to do it and like agreed to fail the whatever the exam was that was based on that speech, because I refused to go in the side door. But that sense of there being spaces that are reserved,
yeah,
is both so it provokes so much curiosity and also so much rage.
Yeah, absolutely. Reserved because of your anatomy, right? Reserved because of what they infer from how you present, not because of your brain. Ugh, it's just, I won't get started, Marin.
We could be here a long time.
It's been on my
That
mind
would be
for
great.
decades. Yeah.
So I think several folks would really like to hear a bit more about how you researched this book. And myself, when I was reading it, I was enchanted to hear about the Museum of Phalluses in Iceland.
Yeah.
But there also are plenty of other really colorful episodes in the book, starting with the first recorded or first observed penis and an insect preserved in amber. So maybe you could tell us a bit about where you went and what you saw and how you figured out what penises you needed to look at.
So there were a lot of penises left on the cutting room floor, as it were. But
I just want to say that is the first like penis joke that either of us have gotten away with. And I have been trying so hard to be like straight down the middle here and not load this conversation with puns.
It's extremely difficult. It's so hard to avoid them, really. Yeah, so many words.
Yeah, I've bitten back the phrase seminal research half a dozen times. Right.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Things like that. Plus the names, the researchers. Speaking of which, I did travel to a lot of labs. I talked to researchers in person on background. I decided that would be best because there's a very strong sort of opinion to this book, right? It takes a stance and it is my opinion in the end. And I didn't want to roll them up in that. And so all my interviews with them were on background. I did travel to the Icelandic Phallological Museum. I was expecting people get very excited about that, right? Because it's a museum full of penises from animals from all over the place, which is interesting. I'm not going to say it's not. And to see them for real and some of the sizes of them, some of the cetacean, the whale penises and stuff, it is pretty amazing. But like I write in the book, it's the same thing with non-human animals as it is with us, or at least it is for me. To see it kind of detached from the animal it belongs to sort of diminishes the animal to me to just this body part again. And so that was a little disconcerting to me, but the gift shop was amazing. So, I would go there. It's apparently closed right now because, pandemic, but I would go for the gift shop if you can make it to Iceland, which is not necessarily that easy of a feat. And otherwise, thousands and thousands of papers, research papers, and a lot of books, obviously, but so many papers, just reading about, the anatomy, the behaviors, and all these kinds of things, and then picking out the ones I thought would be most illustrative.
So for my students' benefit, maybe you could talk a little bit about how you organize those thousands of papers and hundreds of interviews into a narrative arc, both sort of how you did it technically, but also how you saw the path of the book unfolding in front of you.
So my technique is kind of probably not going to help anybody because it's a pretty, it's almost analog. It's so terrible. I do this with everything. I just dump things in buckets. And so I know it's in the bucket when I want to go find it. But in terms of what I used from them, I went through and of course I selected the information that I wanted to use and I put it into a document. And then I took that document and I just wrote a forced draft, right? You just use write. And like I said, for those initial drafts, I just went through, I just used my voice and put the data in, right? And characterized it just using my voice. If a joke came to me, I put it in there and later on decided it was not very good and take it out again, etc. But I also mapped them out because, as you may have noticed, this could have been a list book, just like, look at this is all the big penises. This is all the little ones. And so you have to come up with a way, I hope it succeeded, I don't know, to frame something like that. And so, in the chapter of look at these giant penises, I decided I was going to make it kind of like a medal contest, and have sort of, gold medal, silver medal, with equivocation, just to make the point that giant is in the eye of the beholder and relative to the size of the owner species. And so I had to pick kind of different framings for different chapters, depending on what the content of that chapter was. So there wasn't one same, I didn't take the same narrative approach to each chapter. A couple of them lended themselves very smoothly to just, this is a narrative, like chronological, especially the last one. But those other ones that I hope that they succeeded, but I did create frameworks for them. like one of them, I use a question that I then go through and, try to answer, like what makes a penis, and then posit what I think probably a lot of people think makes one, and then little by little chip away at that through the chapter. So that was kind of how I approached that, dealing with that, instead of just going, here are some penises. So I tried to be creative.
If you had gone with the just here are some penises, or with the book, as you say, I mean, there's so much material that would have supported that. When I was reading the book and reading your descriptions of all the shapes and the complexity, and there's one point where you talk about one particular type of turtle, right? And the penis has sort of like a cup at the end that is left kind of grasping when the partner
flowers that open and close.
Turtle moves away. I mean, I know he wasn't talking about penises when he said this, but I was reminded of Darwin's endless forms most beautiful. Right? There are the variety and almost fanciful complexity is really remarkable, and it's something that that in the text of the book, I have the sense reading it that you're kind of having a good time with this. Absolutely. Right? That you're not dutifully and unemotionally or emotionlessly cataloging this, but actually taking an almost kind of aesthetic pleasure in how incredibly varied your topic has turned out to be.
I enjoyed those chapters. So there were certain chapters, I'd be like, oh, I can't wait to write this chapter. It's going to be so fun, because of what the content was. And I did, where I thought that, I had concerns that maybe it would get boggy or something. I did set some scenes with some animals, I sort of really like drew a picture. I focused on some of them just so that there would be this sense of not just here's the penis, here's the next one, but here's this whole animal, here's what they do. And also to help make the point that, the less adorned they are, the more they go through all of these really intricate steps before they make physical contact, or if they're super adorned, it's just like, boom, you're done, you're out of there. So I did try to illustrate the patterns I was trying to highlight with some useful stories, little narratives here and there with bugs and things.
We've got a couple more questions, but before we run out of time, there is one that I wanted to ask you that has really been on my mind. And that is what the reception to the book has been like, because we've been talking so much about penises as a sort of icon of cultural power and as a stand-in for the idea of masculinity, and you are a woman, and I'm wondering if people have essentially criticized you for not having standing to write this book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There was a fellow who tried to trick sociologists by writing a paper about the conceptual penis that he just made up, and he got it in a journal. He was very pleased with himself, and he saw my tweets about the book and sort of gathered his people to come in and tweet at me. And one of the questions that they asked was, well, what business do you have writing a book about penises? And I said, well, actually, I got this response, I've got to admit, from a colleague, but I thought it was so great. And now when I get that, which I still, people still say that, I say, well, really, I kind of wrote a book about vaginas. So, because I sneaked that in, Trojan horse. But the other, I don't respond to critiques that are ad hominems. And so if they are critiquing me because of, how I present or my age or the way I look or whatever, I don't respond to that. And I have actually not gotten critiques yet from people who are taking it on facts and intellectually, honestly querying some fact in the book or even an opinion in how I've argued it. I'd be happy to do that. There are some people who are very offended that it's feminist, which is interesting, or surprised at any rate that it's feminist, which, it is. So that's, I anticipated that. Obviously not everybody's going to be super thrilled at a penis book that takes a feminist approach, but I feel that in the end, it's also a defense of people who present as men, because I would like for them to be taken as whole people and not just this body part or not.
So I'm so glad you ended that comment with that, because it's a perfect segue to the last thing I want to ask, which is also what some of our commenters have asked. And that is, if you had one If there's one lesson that you'd like people to take away from the book, one thought, one reframing of the world from here forward, what would that be?
That would be that we need to stop centering penises as the avatar of an entire human being. They don't make the man, and a man doesn't necessarily have a penis.
Okay.
Trying to wrap that one up in a nice sentence. So
I'm checking our questions to see if there's anything I've neglected, but I don't think there is. I think we're in very good shape, and I really appreciate everyone for sending in these questions, because they're great. Tell us a little bit about the book that comes next, the Brain book.
Okay. This is, I pitched this book before everything that happened in 2020.
You are a hero for writing two at the same time, by the way, in case I haven't made that clear.
Thank you. Hero. I had envisioned it as just sort of like, this is a look at claims of what will quote unquote rewire your brain, and taking it more from the perspective of, instead of trying to change your brain with something external, and looking at evidence-based things that will help you with, like feeling sharper and that kind of stuff. Yes. But also looking at your environment, what's around you, and the other people in your life, and maybe consider not focusing only on making adjustments and adaptations and accommodations for your brain, but doing that on behalf of other people as well, because we are a pro-social species, and clearly we have some things that we need to mend. We have divides, big and small, and we don't need to necessarily reach out across all of these. That's not called for in every case. But when we want to, I think we need some tools to do it. So that has become a big part of the focus of the book now.
So a little bit more about that. So it's a manual.
I am looking at a specific circuit in the brain that we use for our social understanding, for our social cognition. And I'm focusing more on what we can do to sharpen our social cognition rather than our cognition. And it turns out there's a piggyback effect anyway, because the sharper your social cognition is, the more intact it is, the more you use it well, the better off you are with your cognition anyway. So I wouldn't say it's a manual, although I am examining evidence and getting rid of some things that don't have a good evidence base, and keeping things and pointing out things that do, but all with that focus on that social cognition and how we can use it to make healthy connections, to keep ourselves healthy and others as well.
And is it based on new research? Is this a relatively new strand of thought?
This is a relatively new strand of thought, and some of this stuff is I keep piling things in like every day. That's a problem. Is like, when do you draw the line, on things? But yeah, this is new, and I think the perspective is new because I'm looking at a lot of things outside the brain, not just things you take to sort of like adjust things inside your brain. So, no.
Well, I hope the new book, when it comes out next year now.
I think so.
Yeah, of course it has to be, because we're almost through this year, which has been both
definitely not going to be
seems to have gone past in like no time at all. Sorry, forget we're in November. So I hope it has as profound an effect on understandings of the brain and of social cognition as I'm sure this book has done on the understanding of the penis and our visions of it as a center of masculinity and power. So thank you for talking to us about that.
Very, very kind. Thank you so much.
Thanks everyone for attending. Just to remind, the book is Fallacy with a PH, Life Lessons from the Animal Penis by Emily Willingham, PhD. It's fantastic. Please go buy it and read it. Thank you all for attending. Thanks to our sponsors, the Emory's Center for the Study of Human Health and Emory College and the Georgia Center for the Book. We will be back next semester with another series of interviews with authors of new books on health and science. And when that announcement of the new series goes out, I hope we will see you all back again. Thank you so much.